back to this chart, again, remember that the posterior pituitary, the neurohypophysis, releases two hormones, and here's where they go. Antidiuretic hormone goes to the kidneys, and basically it causes us to reabsorb water from the filtrate of that was becoming urine, and then the oxytocin goes to different places. One thing, it does help with milk ejection and labor contractions, and but what I want you to remember is that they did not have regulatory hormones that caused them to be released. They were actually made in the hypothalamus itself. Okay, moving on to some of our other glands and where they're at, what they look like, what they secrete, what they do. Here's our thyroid gland. And remember, this is the thyroid cartilage. Thyroid meant shield. So this is actually named after the thyroid cartilage, even though most people are probably more familiar with hearing about the thyroid gland. So think that it's kind of like a shield around the trachea area at the upper portion of the trachea near the bottom of the larynx. Alright, so anyway, we literally have the structure that is bilobed, two big lobes with sometimes a area in the middle. We'll look at this a little bit more detail in just a second. But the thyroid gland is the largest of our endocrine glands, and it helps secrete T3, triiodothyronine, also called triiodothyroxine, and thyroxine. Okay, so T3 and T4, the 3 and the 4 have to do with how many iodines are on this. But what this is basically going to do, what T3 and T4 is basically going to do, is basically control how we burn our energy, so to speak. Okay, the other hormone that's produced from the thyroid gland is calcitonin, and it's used for calcium metabolism. In other words, if we get too much calcium in our blood, this hormone's released, and it helps us kind of balance that, go through that homeostatic balance of the calcium, so it helps remove the calcium from our blood. Okay, this is a good chart to kind of compare the thyroid gland to the parathyroid gland. The thyroid gland with the follicular epithelium. Notice these follicle cells here, and that's where we're going to produce our T3 and our T4. But they're going to be able to go to most cells because, again, if we say somebody is hyperthyroid, means that they are producing a lot of T3 and T4, and that's causing them to increase their energy utilization. If we say somebody's hypothyroid, that means they're not producing enough T3 and T4, therefore they're not burning the energy, and therefore they're going to be sluggish and start having weight gain. Okay, so again, this is necessary for growth and development. Most of the time we think of it in the energy relationship between burning energy and oxygen consumption. Alright, so again, what causes us to release T3 and T4? Well, our thyroid stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary is what triggers this to be released from the thyroid gland, specifically the follicular cells. Now, the C cells in the thyroid gland, and if you look here, you'll see a C cell there, and a C cell kind of outside of the follicular cells. It's the C cells that produce a hormone called calcitonin. And what that does, that goes to our bone and kidneys, and it decreases the calcium that's in our blood, okay, and it's stimulated by a high blood calcium level. So again, it's basically removing calcium from the blood. So we got too much calcium. Well, on the other hand, our parathyroid glands, which actually are on the back of the thyroid, they're released from chief cells. They're going to cause the parathyroid hormone to be released from chief cells. It's going to go to the same place, bone and kidneys, but instead of decreasing the calcium levels of the blood, it's going to release calcium, cause calcium to be released. So in this case, we've got too much calcium in the blood. In this case, we've got too little calcium in the blood. So parathyroid hormone is going to cause us to actually release more calcium, and it'll be stimulated again, the release of the parathyroid by low calcium levels. So basically, parathyroid hormone and calcitonin are doing the opposite. This is calcitonin is being released when we have too much calcium, so we can decrease the calcium, and parathyroid hormones are being released when we have too little calcium, so we can increase the calcium levels. Now again, we're seeing both of our glands here. We're seeing actually the thyroid gland with the lateral lobes on it and the isthmus, and we're seeing the parathyroid glands here on the back of that thyroid. Okay, so again, parathyroid glands produce parathyroid hormone. As we just said, parathyroid hormone increases calcium levels when we have low calcium in the blood. Now, I really love this homeostatic chart because here it gives us our normal calcium levels, 8.5 to 11 milligrams per deciliter. So if we drop below 8.5, we need to do something about it. Or if we go above 11, we need to do something about it. So notice, going out of that range is a disturbance in homeostasis. Okay, so if we go above that, we have rising calcium levels in the blood, then the thyroid gland is going to be able to monitor that and recognize that, and then it's going to release the calcitonin, which is going to increase the absorption of calcium into the bone. Okay, so if calcium is taken out of the blood, put into the bone, then our blood calcium levels are going to decline. It's also going to increase the excretion of calcium in the kidneys. So we will be, instead of reabsorbing that calcium into our blood once we filter it out through the glomerulus, we will actually go ahead and send it through the tubules and leave it in the urine when we excrete or when we get rid of the urine. So that either way, both of these are actually going to get calcium out of the blood, so we bring it back into the normal ranges. Now, what if, because obviously if we get too much of something, we can get too little of something. What if our calcium levels fall below this in our blood? Then now we need to get more into the blood. Well, it's our parathyroid hormones that monitor this. And of course, then what they're going to do is they're going to cause a release of calcium from the bones. They're going to cause us to reabsorb calcium into the blood at the kidneys. Remember how the kidneys do 3 different jobs. They basically filter out at the glomerulus, and they reabsorb the majority of what they filtered out in the tubules back into the peritubular capillary. So that's what's happening here. Instead of getting rid of calcium in my urine, I'm reabsorbing it in the kidneys. And then I'm also going to stimulate or be stimulated by calcitriol, which was actually produced by the kidneys. And what that's going to do is that's going to have me actually absorb the calcium and phosphate in my digestive tract. But ultimately what all 3 of these things do is they cause my blood calcium levels to rise again. So again, it's a negative feedback loop, takes it from low back to high. And so again, this is causing me to, the thyroid gland, the calcitonin is causing me to pull calcium out of the blood to lower it. And the parathyroid hormone is causing me to basically release calcium from my bones and reabsorb in the kidneys instead of being released in the urine at the kidneys. And then also stimulate calcitriol, which is produced, let me correct that, the stimulation of the calcitriol causes us to basically reabsorb in the digestive tract, just like we reabsorbed here in the kidneys. Okay, our next area that's affected is our adrenal glands. And the adrenal glands literally have an outside capsule, but then just underneath the capsule, they have a cortex. Remember, cortex means bark. They have a medulla. Medulla means pith. Okay, and so the cortex itself has 3 different regions or zones called the zona reticularis, zona fasciculata, and zona glomerulosa. So here's my capsule, the very outside, and running from outside to the end, because this is my medulla. I have the glomerulosa on the very outside, the fasciculata in the middle, and then the reticularis, which would be the zone next to the middle, or the medulla. All right, well, the medulla, the very inside of the adrenal gland, is where we have our epinephrine and norepinephrine. So that's actually going to take neural stimulation, as we mentioned earlier. Okay, now that we are at the zona glomerulosa, going from the outside in, is actually where our aldosterone is. Now remember, we talked about the renin to aldosterone pathway. We talked about that in lecture. So here's where aldosterone is going to be released, either due to the stimulation of angiotensin II or due to the stimulation of a large potassium level in our bloods. Okay, so that aldosterone is one of those two hormones that helps us in water retention. Okay, so, and when I say water retention, that means getting water out of the filtrate that was becoming urine and keeping water inside the body. So if we're dehydrated, we certainly can't afford to lose water. Aldosterone helps us do that. Now, the zona vesiculata is where cortisol, so this middle area is where we produce cortisol and hydrocortisone and corticosterone. But the main one we'll talk about is the cortisol, because it is so important. It's basically what's called the stress hormone. It literally is there to help us in stressful situations, because what it does, it actually helps break down proteins, so that if we are injured, then we have the ability to actually take the breakdown products and to heal faster. The problem is when we're under stress due to perception situations instead of due to actual physical harm, then we're breaking down proteins, especially those that have to do with our immune system, but we're not really using them to heal faster. So we tend to, under stressful situations, we tend to break things down without healing, especially when the stress is not physical in nature. Now, the last zone is the zona reticularis, which is this area next to the medulla, and this is where females and children actually get their testosterone, which is necessarily for some muscle growth and bone growth. Now, as it says here, it's not important in adult men because we get our testosterone primarily from the testes, so what little bit more we get from here, it's not going to make that much of a difference. But for females and children, this is your source of testosterone, which again, you don't have near as much as a man, but you do need some, especially for muscle growth and bone growth. Okay, moving on to the next organ that is both an endocrine and exocrine organ. We're going to talk about its endocrine functions. We know that as an exocrine organ, it made the digestive enzymes and put them into this duct, and they did that with the Acini cells. But as an endocrine organ, we have these kind of rounded areas that we call pancreatic islets, or islet of Langerhans, and these have cells in them that are going to help us produce our two major hormones here, insulin and glucagon. Okay, insulin was made from beta cells within those pancreatic islets. And again, here's our homeostatic chart. So here's our normal levels of glucose, 70 to 110. Now, if we get too much, if we get above that 110 milligrams per deciliter in our blood, then that disturbs our homeostasis, and we're going to want to remove some of that glucose from our blood. Therefore, those beta cells will start releasing insulin, which will cause the transport of that glucose into our cells. And so insulin it does several things, which I'll discuss on the next video.